let me actually use the microphone. Oh, and by the way, during Q&A, you have microphones on your table, and they light up green when you know you're using them right. I am Jeremy Coons. I've met most of you. Ron Loeffler is my esteemed co-organizer. Welcome you to our workshop, Collective Intentionality, Normativity, and the Space of Reasons, engaging Wilfrid Sellars. Thank you all for coming. I know this is a significant investment of time for everybody, and for most of you, it's also a good deal of traveling as well. I want to start off by thanking all the people who made this possible. First, Georgetown University in Qatar and Dean Safwan Masri for providing the generous support to enable everybody here to come here. So that was, I really appreciate Dean Masri for that. All of you obviously have been in a lot of contact with Pia, who has tirelessly worked to make sure that everyone got here without any difficulty. So we've had a lot of logistical help from Manahil and Sabika, who've really helped make this a really nice venue for us. AV has done a nice setup for us. The travel office worked with everybody to make your travel, as far as I can tell, pretty problem-free for everybody. So that's been great. I also want to thank Bernard for helping us referee the abstracts. That was really helpful. And finally, to Ronald. This is the second workshop that we've co-organized. It's been great working with him, and I do hope that we get to work again together. It's been a real pleasure. Robert Brandom once wrote, "Wilfrid Sellars is the greatest American philosopher since Charles Sanders Peirce. He's the most profound and systematic epistemological thinker of the 20th century." It's an exciting time to be working in Sellars studies. The field has grown exponentially in the last 20 years. Sellars is finally beginning to take his place, I think, in the canon, and philosophers are beginning to recognize his contribution to 20th century philosophical thought. The study of Sellars' contributions to practical philosophy, or the study of Sellars' practical philosophy in particular, is an exciting field to be in. This is a field that's really taken off in the last 5 years. But I'm most excited about this collaboration right here that we're starting today. Sellars produced the first philosophical account of we intentions. But there has been, as has been frequently commented on, a kind of a disconnect between the literature, the contemporary literature on collective intentionality, and scholarship on Sellars. And this is a gap that Ronald and I really wanted to bridge when we were conceiving of this workshop. So what we have here, we have some of the leading scholars on collective intentionality and team reasoning, and we have philosophers who have produced the best recent scholarship on Sellars' practical philosophy. And I'm hopeful that this collaboration is going to produce significant progress in Sellars' scholarship, and I hope that work in collective intentionality can also be enriched by this collaboration. In particular, perhaps, I hope that we can make progress on Sellars' project of using collective intentionality to articulate the moral point of view. Obviously, a goal that was near and dear to his heart. This is an exciting collaboration. I look forward to the next 3 days of conversation, and I'm very eager to see the scholarship that emerges from this collaboration. So welcome all to Doha, welcome to our workshop, and thank you all for being here. Our first speaker, of course, is Natalie Gold, and I will let Ronald do the introductions.
I'm standing here too for a moment. It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce our first speaker and our first keynote for this workshop, Professor Natalie Gold. She is the visiting professor in practice at the Center for Philosophy of Natural and Social Sciences at the London School of Economics. She holds an philosophy and a PhD from Oxford University, and has had numerous postdocs and visiting professorships at prestigious universities. I'm not going to rattle down the list, it's a pretty long list. She's the author of over 60 articles on topics as diverse as collective intentionality, team reasoning, cooperation and coordination, moral judgments and decision-making, trust, self-control, and then also what seems more applied, financial regulation and the use of behavioral sciences in public health. Today's talk by Natalie is entitled Practical Reasoning When Individual and Collective Perspectives Conflict. Please join me in welcoming Natalie Gould.
Brilliant, thanks. That's very helpful, especially because the title slide seems to have somehow gone awry. Can you hear me? Oh, it makes quite a big difference where I stand, doesn't it? Is that, which one? Can people hear me when I stand there, or should I be right in front of the mic? Right in front of the mic, says Glenda. Okay, good. Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be here. I actually want to say, when I was on the plane and I told, most people on my plane were actually changing to go to exotic locations, and I said to the person in the seat next to me that I was going to go to a conference in Doha, and she was like, you must have such a glamorous job to go to a conference in Doha. I think, well, but actually I look here and it's actually very beautiful, and absolutely agree with Jeremy that it's a wonderful setup. So thank you so much for inviting me. Maybe I should lay some things on the table about where I'm coming from first. I'm not a Sellars scholar at all. What I do more is a sort of empirically grounded moral psychology, so I very much take into account how people actually reason and make decisions when I'm thinking more philosophically about how they should reason and make decisions. And I work on team reasoning and intentions, which obviously have a lot of parallels to Sellars, hence the point of this workshop. So what I want to do, and then probably alongside that, I should sort of apologize in advance, not being a Sellars scholar. Obviously, if I make mistakes in how I set up Sellars, I'm trying to be not controversial, say anything difficult, but if I say anything wrong, please correct me. But also, so I'm sort of coming to my thinking on this, and it's sort of changing a bit as I'm moving along, so I'm really interested to see what you make of it, and there are definitely points where I'm uncertain what way to go, and be very interested to get some feedback. So what I want to talk about is something in Sellars that sort of really resonated with me, but also puzzled me. So I'm going to sort of first do that by sort of, as I call it, reconstructing, hopefully non-controversially, bits of Sellars. And then go through some parallel with team reasoning, which is the literature that I've contributed to a lot and much more familiar with. So some ways in which I think it's similar, some ways in which I think it's different, how the problem resonates with what's going on in team reasoning literature. Then I'm going to do what I call psychologize the issue. So I'm going to bring in some psychology. But really at its heart, what I want to talk about is choosing between IMOs and WEMOs. So then I'm going to come back to that at the end. Okay. So, yeah, first, Sellars reconstruction. As I said, I'm not a Sellars scholar, so please correct me if my reconstruction of Sellars should not be right. But this is supposed to be non-controversial. So we'll see. Okay, so one thing that really intrigued me about Sellars was the idea that practical reasoning issues an intention. So rather than practical reasoning issuing in a belief about what you should do, practical reasoning actually straight out issues an intention to do something. And why would you think that? Because if somebody says, does some reasoning and intends to do something, it would be just very strange if they then didn't take the actions to do it. So if I sort of did some practical reasoning about going to Doha and decided I'm going to go to Doha, and then I didn't take any of the necessary steps to get my flight and to come here, you'd say, well, I don't really intend to do it. So it's this kind of flow from practical reasoning into action that I found very interesting, and its implications. And combined with this idea that you can have multiple types of intention is both intriguing to me and puzzling. So the other thing about Sellars is this idea that you can have at least 3 types of intention. So firstly, this sort of I intention, where it's me saying I shall go to Doha for the Sellars workshop. But secondly, a kind of we intention that's an intersubjective intention. What does that mean? So I think that's supposed to mean that everyone can agree with them, everyone can have the same intention, they're not indexical. So, we can all have a we intention that I'm going to do what I can, ceteris paribus, to promote the success of the Sellars workshop. But then the move from there to a third sort of intention, that's a moral intention, that is a type of we intention, but what we're going to call it a categorically valid intersubjective intention. Why is that? Because there's a sense in which it's supposed to be categorically reasonable, so it's kind of Kantian idea. So you start from a premise that it would be reasonable for everyone to accept, like it should be the case that our welfare is maximized, so we intend that it will be the case that our welfare is maximized, and then you can use that to get to an intersubjective intention that everyone ought to have. So we should make it the case that each of us does these actions, A, in circumstances C, they're going to maximize our welfare. So putting those two things together should get you to this sort of nice payoff that moral judgments express intentions. So reasoning is supposed to always end in intention. Moral reasoning is a form of practical reasoning ending in a we intention. So if you make a moral judgment, you should then intend to do something. And that looks like a very neat sort of solution to a puzzle in meta-ethics about how to move from judging that it's right to do something to being motivated to do it. So that kind of gap between moral judgment and moral action, it solves that problem because the moral reasoning simply issues an intention to act, as opposed to issuing a belief about what I should do, with intentions being downstream. But then, so what I find puzzling about that, though, is, but we've got all these different types of intention, and in theory, they could lead to different actions. So if your reasoning is then supposed to automatically express an intention, but I can see 3 different ways of looking at it. I can look at it as me, I can look at it as me qua group member, I can look at it as me qua member of the community of humanity, or sort of moral group member. And each of them is supposed to be a judgment that issues an intention, but they conflict. And to me, that seems kind of puzzling. So how would one deal with that? So now to sort of see where I'm coming from, I want to draw some parallels to team reasoning. Now here, the conflict is kind of a potential conflict between I and we intentions is really central to the story. And that's partly because if you go back and think about the background of team reasoning, where it came from, sort of one of these triggers is paradoxes of rational choice, like, for instance, the prisoner's dilemma. So what's paradoxical about the prisoner's dilemma? So there is one dominant solution, which is defect. And if you look at the matrix, so player 1, whose payoffs come first, assume that player 2 cooperates, 4 is greater than 3, they should defect. Assume that player 2 defects, 1 is greater than 0, they should defect. Symmetrical, they should both defect. But they could have both got higher payoff if they both cooperated. And one way of thinking about that is, well, it's a bit of a tension between sort of standard game theoretic reasoning that's telling people to ask, what should I do? And then this very classic individualistic reasoning strategy gets you the answer that you should defect. And the whole reason that the prisoner's dilemma is puzzling is because we intentions seem to give you a different answer. So this idea that if we could all ask, what should we do? Hopefully the result would be cooperate. I mean, pretty definitely it wouldn't be defect, because if we asked, what should we do? We both get more out of both cooperating than we do out of both defecting. To get to we should cooperate, you might have to make some assumptions about the desirability or undesirability of ending up in the kind of asymmetric situation where one player cooperates, one player defects. But the answer to what should we do at least seems to be not defect. So that's a straight contradiction to the answer of I reasoning. And plausibly it's to cooperate. So there's, already there's no suggestion that there's a possibility of conflict and a worry about what people are going to do when both of them are available. So in team reasoning, the way of dealing with these sort of issues like the prisoner's dilemma, where individual and group sort of goals and what people ought to do might come apart, and to allow that it could be rational to do the group thing, we start off with this idea that people can identify with the groups that they're in, call it group identification. So a person, or in team reasoning, often it will be a game theoretic background, and I sort of wobble a bit in my language. I really don't think team reasoning is only expressible using game theory, but obviously it was originally set up in it, so a lot of the language is sort of game theoretic, comes out of that tradition. So if you've got a player or person I who identifies with the group G, if they conceive of G as a unit of agency, acting as a single entity in pursuit of a single objective. So it's a very specific idea of a group as an agent and a person who can identify with that group. And then set up a sort of reasoning, call it a reasoning schema, again, sort of reasoning from premises to conclusion, that can potentially get you into the cooperative solution. And again, you use, just to make it easier, and some notation, S is a group, U is a payoff function. Again, you can think of it as a group objective. I really don't think it has to get hung up on whether it uses expected utility or not. And A is a profile of action, so it's an action for every member of the group. And set up the idea of a reasoning schema where people can say, I'm a member of S, so I'm a member of this group. And again, I'm going to say don't get hung up on the common knowledge because there are versions without common knowledge, but for simplicity, imagine a situation in which it's common knowledge that every member in the group all identifies with the group. So we can all be pretty certain that we're all acting together. So this is actually your more classic small-scale sort of group action that you see in the collective intentionality literature, probably, assuming that it's common knowledge that everyone identifies. And if it's common knowledge that everybody wants to maximize the value of the payoff function, which also could just be cashed out as sort of achieve some sort of group objective, and it's common knowledge that there's a set of this set of actions, and if everybody does their part, then we get this objective that we all want. In that case, you could reason that someone can reason that I should choose my component of that profile. Now, the thing about this reasoning schema is it can get you either I or we reasoning, depending on whether S is an individual or a group. So it could be, you could have a degenerative situation where with a group of one, and then it would be I'm a member of a group of myself, in which case it's pretty clear that I would identify with myself, want my payoffs to be maximised, and take actions that maximise them. But equally, if I'm a member of a group and we all identify, then I can take that action. So you can see that it's the same basic structure of a reasoning schema, depending on which group it is, could lead to an instruction to defect if I'm reasoning as an individual in a prisoner's dilemma. So I'm a member of the group myself, I want to maximize my payoffs, then the payoff maximizing choice is to defect. But equally, if you're in a team, assume it's a prisoner's dilemma and there's two of you, and there's common knowledge that you both identify with your group, and you want to maximize the value of your payoff, then it's quite clear that defecting doesn't, and with some assumptions about how you value the off-diagonal outcomes, you could get to I should choose cooperate, so my component of cooperate. So I'm interested in sort of bringing out possible differences, things that might resonate or be different with Sellars. And so what I can see here, that I'm not sure if you do see it in Sellars, is it's sort of the same schema with the same premises, but it has got different actions at the end. And actually, that's kind of maybe an interesting point back to the Sellars scholars, because as I think it's going to come again later, even if you're in a group, often the people in the group have to do different things. So even if we all want to promote the success of the workshop, we all have to get on different airplanes in different places. So somewhere you might have to cash it out as people having to do different actions. Also, the other thing, certainly the way that Bob Sugden and I set this up, is that actually it is ending in a belief. I should choose my component of the set of actions, but that was sort of with a view that generally once you form a belief that you should do something, then you do form an intention to do it, and I do think, as Sellars thought, that that is the usual case. And again, going back to that sort of economic modelling literature that comes from, there's no difference between decisions and actions. You have a model of an agent, and they decide something at the end, they do it. So there's not really a distinction between the outcome of reasoning as intention, but we did cash out the outcome of reasoning as a belief about what you should do, partly because of the idea that rationality is directive, and this is practical rationality. It should be telling people what they ought to do. And so that sort of got you two of Sellars' types of intentions, but the third sort of intention that he has is saying that morality is a type of we-intention, and again, there are people who have views that come out sort of within that area, and you can get morality as a sort of we-intention in either a consequentialist or a Kantian framework. So on, I can't tell if you're seeing left or right, on the left, it's a picture of Donald Regan's book, Utilitarianism and Cooperation, and he's often seen as an early proponent of team reasoning. He thought that one ought to be utilitarian, but maybe not everybody in the world is a utilitarian, so we ought to join with everybody else who's willing to do the same as us and cooperate with them in order to maximise good. So find the people who are cooperating, produce the best consequences given the behaviour of non-cooperators. And then, so in a world in which everyone was a utilitarian, then you could get cooperative utilitarian out of the schema on the previous slide. You have just S as the group of humanity, and we're trying to maximise the good of humanity. And in a world where we're not all utilitarian, you can play around with it a bit so that you are members of a group T, but you're members of a subgroup of humanity, but maximising the good of all of humanity. Similarly, we have Anderson's got an idea that team reasoning might be part of morality, or says something that could sound very similar to team reasoning, but obviously she's a Kantian, and she's thinking about what's the rational basis for committed action, and again, has got an argument that follows that kind of team reasoning schema. If you have a group of individuals, they identify themselves as members of the group, and they see their actions as jointly advancing a common goal, then it can be rational for each member of the group to choose their component of the strategy profile that best advances the goal. And she thinks of it as a kind of collective deliberation, structured by a principle that whatever can count as a reason for action for one member of the group must count as a reason for all. And then it becomes rational for Kantian reasons. So again, sort of a neat parallel with Sellars as a way of cashing out the we intentions, where it follows from morality, although in this case that's about, it's about who you define as a group and how you define what people have to do, and then some sort of argument that we ought to do it for moral reasons. But, I mean, all of this team reasoning stuff, it is sort of instrumental practical reasoning, and it does presuppose that there's some sort of agency, and you can see it in these two premises that are in red. So you have potential groups that you can be a member of, and you may or may not identify with them. So you end up with sort of conditional outcomes. It can be rational to defect in a prison's dilemma if you identify as an individual, but it can be rational to to cooperate if you identify as a team. And so which way you cash out the schema, there's a single template schema, but you can cash it out in different ways by putting in different groups and different group identifications. And you need to group identify or conceive yourself as a unit of agency in order to be able to fill in the premises and reason to the end. So there's a sense in which if you set it up with two different groups, you'd end up with two mutually exclusive schemas, because you have one that says I'm a member of the group myself, so it's individual agency, and one that says I'm a member of the group of us, so it's a we agent. And in a prison's dilemma, they could take you to different outcomes. And one of the things this shows certainly about means-end instrumental reasoning is just the need to presuppose the unit of agency in order to be able to do the reasoning. So there's sort of a sense in which you can't use these to reason to conflicting conclusions because you need to choose a unit of agency first to be able to activate the premises. And if you're thinking of yourself instrumentally, it's just sort of not really consistent to think of yourself both as me and as us. I have to choose one of them first to reason from. But then that leads to this question of, and what do you do when there's a conflict? And here, going back to sort of the two economists who were really the driving forces behind team reasoning, sort of two different ways of thinking about it. One comes from Michael Bacharach out of the makes it a psychological matter. So he was very interested. So that the Beyond Individual Choice, that is the book cover, but he actually at one point quite wanted the two vases, the two faces vase illusion as the book cover. Why? Because he thought of team reasoning versus individual reasoning as being sort of a way you saw the world. So there's two ways of seeing it. I can see myself as an I, or I can see myself as an us, and they're kind of incompatible as units of agency. And features of my situation will pick out which of them is salient for me right now, and then given that, I will either reason as an individual or I'll reason as a team. And then contrast that with, say, Bob Sugden, who, if anything, is like the, I say, nihilist. So for him, it's simply a form of valid reasoning that, as a matter of fact, people use. And Bob wouldn't want to make any claims about you might empirically study when people use one rather than use the other, but he doesn't want to say, well, you should use one rather than the other, or you are somehow forced by your environment to use one rather than the other. It's simply, here's a form of valid reasoning, you might want to use it. And that partly goes into his sort of wider picture about how he thinks of the world and about people cooperating together to make a community of advantage. So sort of two very different ideas about how you'd resolve conflicts. One is that, well, you don't really have a choice. Something in the environment pushes you down one route or the other. And one is, well, there's two routes, and yeah, people get to choose, basically. And so for me, in a way, this is sort of where I feel like team reasoning starts with the conflict. It doesn't necessarily tell you how to resolve it that well, but it starts from it, whereas Sellars, it seems to fall out of it in a way that I think is quite important. Anyway, so I said I was going to psychologize it, and I am. What I want to psychologize is the thing about Sellars that really resonated with me, partly compared to the team reasoning account. So the idea of Sellars that reasoning must issue an intention, and obviously the original statements of team reasoning didn't. That resonates. Why? Partly because he's basically right. The majority of time, we don't do a bunch of reasoning, then think, oh yes, I should do that, and then think, oh, okay, now that I've decided I should do it, I better start to make a plan of action. Usually we just go ahead and reason things through and do things. However, one of the reasons he's right about that is because most actions aren't actually preceded by conscious thinking. So I don't know how many people are familiar with dual process theory, so I will say a little bit about it, also just to ground what I'm going to say about it. This is a nice little picture from Danny Kahneman. And the idea is that it's sometimes called two systems. I think it's better thought of as sort of two families of mental processes that go on when underpinning people's actions and decisions and judgments. And one sort of family, known as System 1, is kind of fast. So it happens quickly, you do it on autopilot, it's explicit and effortless, associative. People don't really control it, and they're not really aware of it. And that's the stuff that goes on 95% of the time. And then there's another sort of family of systems that are much slower, There's much more explicit reasoning. They're effortful. You might use logic. They're very deliberately controlled and self-aware. And that, he says, we only use about 5% of the time. So examples, very sort of classic example he gives of system one, fast thinking. If I ask you 2 times 2, the answer probably pops into your head. Whereas if I ask you 47 times 47, you might have to do some mental arithmetic. But it's also very relevant to things like actions. And I mean, so I'm sort of partly mounting towards why we should care about system one thinking, even if you're thinking about philosophy of action. So, you know, imagine when you're learning to drive. Initially, it's very sort of system 2 process. You're thinking about how to do it, you're making decisions, you're learning, but eventually you bed it down and it becomes effortless and it basically becomes automatic. Similar sort of example, you know, imagine taking your commute where you pretty much go on autopilot versus when you're in your new place and you get the map out and you work out where to go. And the thing is, but it's really important that we have a bunch of sort of fast automated thinking, because otherwise we spend all our lives in cognitive deliberation, but we don't really want to throw out all that stuff as non-agential, like a lot of those actions like driving, you might do it on autopilot, but you're probably pretty responsible for what happens when you're doing it. The other thing about systems 1 and 2 is that they can also sometimes come into conflict, and sometimes system 2 can come in as a corrective. So a very standard example in psychology literature is this cognitive reflection test due to Shane Frederick, and you may have come across this before, but in case not. So he's got, it's a set of questions a bit like this. One of them is, a ball and a bat together cost $1.10, the bat costs $1 more than the ball, how much does the ball cost? So if your intuition, probably, if it's like most people, is to say 10 cents, but if you step back and look at it, the answer is actually 5 cents, because if you've got $1.10 in total and the bat has to cost $1 more than the ball, it's got to be 5 and $1.05. And there's a kind of intuitive associative answer, but if you then caught yourself thinking no, that's because the sort of system 2 thinking can come up and override it and check your errors. And actually, Shane Frederick thought it was surprising how many people didn't check their errors. But nevertheless, people do and can, and it's an example of a sort of system 2 overriding. So, yeah, as I said, I really think system 1 needs to count as reasoning, the sort of stuff that philosophers are studying, because otherwise philosophers find they're not studying very much at all. And there are a lot of views of reasoning and philosophy, and some of them are consistent with the idea that that system 1 thinking is reasoning. I mean, you know, if you think that there's a kind of basic norm that what we're doing in reasoning is making some inferences from beliefs and desires and drawing conclusions, maybe about what to do, but that leaves a lot of scope for different ways of doing it. Now, I mean, I think the natural thing is to lapse into thinking that reasoning is intentional, but actually not very many people say that. Now, one person who does is actually Philip Pettit, back in 2007, has got a paper where he characterizes reasoning as something that you do at an intentional, personal level. So he's making it intentional as opposed to non-intentional. So for him, he says, quote, "It's a form of control in which I intentionally pursue the satisfaction of rational desiderata rather than merely relying on my non-intentional processing." Well, he may think that. I think then he's very constrained in what he's looking at, because he's looking at about 5% of what we do. And then to me it gets very worrying how we do things like attribute control and responsibility for many things that we tend to think we're responsible for, but do using system 1 processes. Luckily, his is not the only game in town, and quite a lot of people have suggested things that could lead you to other routes that would allow you to include some of that automatic sort of subconscious processing as types of reasoning. One person is sort of Gilbert Harman, who thought that reasoning was sort of a reasoned change in view. And what he said, so yeah, the little picture down the bottom of people who hold these positions in each row. And so he's the second one. And he said, one can reason without knowing what the relevant principles of revision are, and it may well be that reasoning is a relatively automatic process whose outcome is not under one's control. So you could think of reasoning as having some parts that are relatively automatic processes, but they still get you down schemas from premises to conclusions, and that's as opposed to reflection. So on that picture, the reasoning is still a causal story, but we have a causal picture of what it is to reason, but we allow that some of it happens subconsciously. But another way you can go is to rely on a sort of Dan Dennett sort of idea about explanation, which slightly weirdly is what Philip Pettit does, even though I think he comes out in the opposite place. So Dennett contrasts levels of explanation, and he would say, well, you've got an explanatory level of people and sensations and activities, as opposed to a subpersonal level of brains and events in the nervous system. And then we can think of some of this attribution of mental states in a much more functionalist manner. We're not really saying necessarily anything about, well, we're looking at what people do and saying that there is some state that's causing them given what they've done. And that actually can take you to another way of thinking about reasoning, where what we're actually doing is explaining what people did. We're not saying anything necessarily about causal processes. We're saying that person did something, and I can infer from the fact they did something that they have some beliefs and desires. And so that really takes you then almost to a position somewhere that David Velleman ends up in, where he says deliberation is sort of ancillary to practical reasoning. I want to say a bit more about David Velleman, but I'm going to say one thing I would throw out to the Sellars scholars is I'm sort of intrigued as to what you think his picture would be about how the reasoning fits in. Is it supposed to be causal? Is it supposed to be conscious? Could he fit a picture where it's actually explanatory? So what we're doing is coming up with sort of, we're giving people agency by explaining their behaviour in normative terms. But I think David Velleman is really interesting, partly because what he says, even though it makes absolutely no reference to psychological literature, fits in so neatly with this kind of view of how people actually reason. And he's got what I've called a supervisatory conception of reasoning. And what he says is, you could think of practical reasoning as being like your spouse in the passenger seat. So the person doing the practical reasoning is not the person doing the driving. The person doing the driving probably has most of their executive control doing the driving. But every so often, there is some advice, some course correction, some sort of interjections that change how things go on. So he basically thinks that the idea that we deliberate before acting is the exception but not the norm. So I think it's very interesting the way that the driver and the passenger, in some senses, is quite similar to those sort of system 1, system 2 processes. And then he sort of says two of the themes that have come up already, but he says that a lot of the practical reasoning consists of supervising a process that's already ongoing, and it also is about placing actions under intentional descriptions so that we can understand ourselves as agents. And in that sense, it's completely backwards looking. It's how we understand ourselves. But these are all activities that happen at the level of the agent, and I think Velleman and probably every philosopher that I showed on the slide before, they think of reasoning as involving types of thinking. It's just that the thinking doesn't always have to be reflection and deliberation. So, and so Velleman ends up in a place where he says, of course, if we wish to discuss a person's reasoning, we must state the contents of his premises and conclusions, and we must state what logical relations he believed to obtain among them. But we shouldn't be deceived by this necessity into assuming that the reasoning under discussion consisted in similar statements rehearsed in the reasoner's behalf. So, on the one hand, I'm very intrigued with the idea of Sellars that reasoning issues an intention, and that's partly because I think it does capture that 95% of what's going on. On the other hand, the minute you set up the possibility that there are different modes of reasoning, it seems like there are points where you're going to have to choose which one to use, and there are going to be conflicts, and how do you resolve that, and how does that fit with the idea that reasoning always issues an intention, which may then get you some traction around moral externalism. So I just want to spend for the last few minutes think a little bit about how we resolve conflicts between our different identities or our different modes of reasoning. I think I'm going to start with the idea that actually, at this point, reflection probably is needed. And just to go back to Bacharach a bit to think why. I mean, I would say sort of he was an economist and he was looking for a nice model that would make nice predictions from features that we in the external environment could see to explain people's behaviour. But I think underneath it all, he must have realised that that wasn't going to be the entire picture. Why? Because somebody who's sort of reasoning, even if they're doing team reasoning or they have a we intention, at the end of the day, they have to take an individual action at the end. So the actions are done by individuals, even if you're in the we mode. There's still, you have to at some point have something that I'm going to do. There's still an I inside of the intention. So even if you're doing sort of we thinking or having a we intention, you've got to be pretty aware of the I. So it's probably likely that you're aware that there are multiple ways that you could view your situation, which then might lead you to different and conflicting actions. Secondly, again, going back to the Bacharach, why would even he have to think that you need reflection? Because back to the idea that the genesis of the team reasoning is around things like the prisoner's dilemma, where there is a conflict between individual reasoning and collective reasoning. And in the prisoner's dilemma, there is the possibility that if you identify with the group, what if the other person isn't really, is double-crossing you, maybe wanting to defect. So he's got something he calls about sort of double-crossing intuition. But it's clearly the case that you can reason about it, and even for Bacharach, he had people entertaining the thought that the other person might defect. So therefore realizing the possibility that there could be I reasoning as well as we reasoning, even if doing we reasoning themselves. So we've sort of got a conflict, and that does introduce the need for some sort of system to reflective reasoning. And then I would say even Bacharach in some work realized it. At one point, even he had this idea of what he called the S frame, it's superordinate frame. So it's like, okay, what if you were in a position and you know that I can reason as an I or I can reason as a we? Which one should I do? And he got about as far as saying, well, if the I reasoning and the we reasoning say the same thing, then the S frame should go with that. We didn't really get very far in solving the conflict. Why? Well, I think some of that is about how we're thinking about this, or how we're thinking about this within the team reasoning literature. So the kind of the schema of reasoning is supposed to be instrumental means-end reasoning. And within the team reasoning literature, when people have tried to say, you should use this mode of reasoning or you should use that mode of reasoning, they're trying to make the choice of mode of reasoning a part of instrumental rationality. And I think that's not something that's going to work. Why? I think, so I'm going to use a concept from Correspond, practical identity, and think of it as basically needing to choose between practical identities. So Correspond thinks of a practical identity as being a description under which you value yourself and find your life worth living and your actions worth undertaking. So then you can think of these I and we modes as some sense being a conflict of different practical identities. Me as my, egoistic self, and me as qua group members. And then when they come to different conclusions, what I really need to do in order to be able to decide which mode of reasoning to use and which action to take is to decide which of those practical identities I'm going with. So it's sort of a choice of identity, which is not the same as a piece of instrumentally rational, practical reasoning. If anything, it's more like some sort of higher level creature construction where we're choosing what sort of person I want to be. But then, so I think that's really more how we need to cash it out, as it were. There can be a level of chooser above the I and the we, but it can't be an instrumentally practical one. It's more one who's choosing about the identity. They're choosing which of the groups' reasoning we're going to follow. And then the next question is, what does that really mean about, for practical reasoning ending in intentions? So it just occurred to me that you can rehearse reasoning like that in your mind. So we've got this sort of system 2 reasoning going on, but it's slightly what you're doing is choosing your identity rather than choosing your actions. It seems naive to think that the bit of the agent that's doing that isn't sort of aware of the schema and the flow down through the schema. I think when I originally started thinking about this, I started thinking, well, this is sort of so bad for Sellars because it's a type of system 2 reasoning. The system 2 reasoning is going to be a sort of theoretical reasoning that ends in a belief. So it's all very nice if you can explain the 95% of automatic stuff. But if your big issue is about basically something where there can be a conflict and the conflict's going to require the system 2 reasoning, then that you're going to have to bring in the idea that it can end up in beliefs. And you maybe lose the idea that reasoning goes straight to an intention. I don't know if I still think that, and maybe it's more an intuition than an argument, but yes, I do think that if there's a way of reasoning ending in intentions, it's still maybe not going to give a nice, neat solution to the moral externalism problem. Why? So we could go back to the sort of position I articulated in the middle of the talk, that the I and we intentions don't conflict because you don't do the reasoning until you've decided the unit of agency. So you might say, well, look, whoever it is, the agent, the level of the agent that's choosing the personal identity, maybe they can rehearse the schemas or they can see them, they know they're there, but you won't get started on them until you've chosen which practical identity you're identifying with today. And in that case, you would say, well, all reasoning ends in an intention because we don't start the reasoning until we've done the choice of unit of agency. And that seems fine. You can keep the idea that the reasoning ends in intention, but I wonder if then you kind of lose the payoff of getting over problems of around moral internalism, moral externalism, because now there's somebody who's making a decision whether to adopt a moral point of view instead. And now we have got a problem where you can say, well, I believe I ought to move to adopt the moral point of view and do the moral team reasoning, but they've got to move from there to doing the reasoning. So instead of getting the gap at the end from I believe I should do this, but I have to form an intention, you get, well, if I could do the reasoning, I'd intend to do it. And I believe I ought to be this sort of person, but I can't get myself to be the sort of person that does the reasoning. So I still think it's going to be slightly problematic for what seemed like a really sort of neat way of solving an old problem. But yeah, I'm interested now. Thanks. I'm interested to know what you think. I don't mind.
We have plenty of time. We have half an hour. Just leave the room.
Yeah.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that. I do have a question about this last bit about system 2 reasoning not ending in intentions, and I wonder. I'm not sure I agree with that actually. I was thinking about this through your talk when you first introduced the distinction between the two kinds of reasoning. And, when I think about, sort of paradigmatic examples of system 2 reasoning, it seems like we can system 2 reason in a practical mode. So, for example, I think about my own extremely painful attempts to learn to play the guitar during the pandemic. And, that's very slow. You talk about the beginner. And where you're very much, trying to, you're thinking very consciously, okay, for this chord I put my fingers here, and for this chord I put my fingers here. It's, it's slow thinking, but it's slow thinking in a practical mode. And so it's not like, I think, oh, I need to put my fingers here, and then that's a belief. It's like, I'm doing it. I'm thinking it, and then as I'm thinking it, I'm doing it. So it's a very intentional action. Or, if I'm working out, something that I'm not smart enough to do anymore, if I'm working out a difficult math problem or a difficult logic problem, that's a doing. And if it requires a great deal of deliberation, while I'm thinking, I'm actually doing it. So I'm writing out the steps. I'm doing the equations. And again, while I'm solving it, I'm actually solving it. I'm deliberating in a practical frame of mind. And so, the intention, there's a constant issuing of intentions during the process of deliberation that's leading to a constant flow of actions that's resulting in a hopefully correct solution that's appearing on the page. And so I do wonder, to me it seems like there is such a thing as practical system 2 reasoning that does issue in a series of intentions and a series of actions.
So I like that. Partly, I think it's a very nice way of articulating why I started to worry whether system 2 only ends in beliefs. And then I am going to say the problem then you end up, though, on the second horn of the... in terms of the getting through from moral reasoning through to action, the way I've set it up and putting it in your terms, then it suggests that you've got reasoning in a practical mode, and then what I'm trying to add on the top is some sort of reasoning about identity. And then I'm going to need to say something like, and reasoning about identity is not reasoning in a practical mode. And so then that you get a gap coming back in there. So, yeah.
So this is something similar, I think, to Jeremy's comment. And I'm not sure about the gap at the top, the idea of framing one's identity as being a point at which you can get this gap between belief and action. So maybe we can come back to that, but just in terms of the claim that system 2 reasoning ends in beliefs, I'm not sure how much weight to put on this, but in the way you articulated it, you used deontic modals. So you talked about what I believe I should do or what I believe I ought to do. And if you think that those modals express judgments of practical reason that should be understood in terms of something like intentions or plans of action, then the fact that system 2 reasoning ends in the belief of what you ought to do isn't in conflict with the thought that your conclusion is an intention. It's a different kind of intention. It's an intention that involves the distinction between what you ought and may do, and so there's stuff you've got to do to make sure that makes sense, but it seems like there's no gap there.
Yeah, I was happy to fall back on, I'm not sure, I think there's a gap there still, but then I'm more interested in you were saying that you want to push about whether there's a gap around choices, about what type of person I want to be, and whether that
Okay,
also
on that side then, and I'm less confident about this, but it seems to me that insofar as I'm in this sort of course guardian frame where I'm thinking about what kind of a person to be, there's an element of decision there too, right? Like think about Sartre's case of the person deciding whether to stay home and care for a sick mother or fight in the resistance. I take it that one of the things we're supposed to draw from that case is that, say what you want about the reasons you think favor one or the other. At the end of the day, the decision it's a decision. It's not just responding to objective facts that are there independent of our perspective, but rather it's an exercise of practical reason. You've got to decide what kind of a person you want to be. And so then again, it seems like even if there's this sort of element of belief at the top prior to engaging in practical reason, I've got to decide what my group identity is. I mean, still, we're using this language of decision. So it seems like there's no gap there either, because you're engaging in reasoning about what to do. It's just who to be is a species of what to do.
Okay, maybe we might want to take that later, but the next step, though. I'm worried that now there's never any gaps between deciding what to do and doing it. So it's true that we might want to start with what happens usually, but it seems like the Sartre case is particularly the sort of case where we might think people are going to be indecisive, they're going to vacillate a bit. You might decide one thing today and decide another thing tomorrow until there's actually been some commitment in doing of stuff. So now I'm going to be like, well, how do we put the gap back in?
Well, so if you're thinking about accuracy, is that what we're worried about? That one person? Yeah, I mean, in my own work, it's important to distinguish the ought and the shall because of the way negation interacts with ought, and then if you do that right, you get accuracy as logically possible but practically incoherent because there's no decision you can make that satisfies all the plans that you've committed yourself to.
We should talk about it later.
Yeah.
I have a question concerning choice of human efficiency. And I just want to hear a bit more about this from you. Because you know a lot about this, but I want to raise a worry here. So choice of unit of agency, that sounds very much like if this is something you do, like you choose between chocolate and pudding. And I feel like this would be a grave mistake because certainly what's going on here is of a very different kind. So it's not choice as choice between options. It's sort of something deeper. And it implies, the way you put it seems to imply that there is already a chooser. And of course, transcendental philosophy would say, yeah, now you're making a mistake here because you're presupposing unit of agency already. And that's it. By putting this in this way, you're not getting at what you want to get at because you already presuppose an answer that there is this unit of agency that's the chooser between units of agency. And I wonder if you think of reasoning more along the lines of governing or gardening or curating something that's already going on. Couldn't you say, well, you know, in the goings on, there is already different, identities implied here, and what you're doing is, what's going on in the eventual choice, in inverted commas, of agency, is sort of already in the stuff that's being curated in the process that is reasoning. I just wonder how you would deal with this objection that you're sort of presupposing what you at the same time suggest is up for grabs in the process.
So I used to be quite against the idea of choosing units of agency because of the fact there's no place to choose them from. But then two things struck me. So one of the problems I had with a lot of the accounts that wanted to choose units of agency is they both assumed that that kind of I persona is a level of agency that can be chosen between and is doing the choosing. And it struck me that it works. It can, or I think it can work if you separate it out. So what you have, so it is introducing a chooser, but it's not a chooser that's a kind of, that's the unit of agency. It is kind of it's an overall unifier. So yes, I think it's tricky, and I want to hear more about like objection. But I think you can't. I think I've come to the point where I think you can't do it without it. I mean, we do make these decisions about what sort of life we want to lead. Somebody makes them. So actually, we can't just say, well, that doesn't fit very nicely into a theoretical account, so we'll just get rid of it and say nobody makes any of these decisions anywhere because it's impossible to theorize a chooser. And start the other way around and think, well, what's the chooser that it makes most sense to theorize? And what would that person look like?
I guess I was a little puzzled at the very beginning because it sounds like you think that if deliberation ends in intentions, then it sounds like you think that you can't really have a conflict of intentions. But we all have conflicts of intentions all the time. And I think the Sellarsian point is that deliberation really ends in volitions. and there's a relationship between an intention and a volition, but we have multiple intentions at any one time, only some of which can become volitions, right? You can't have a volition to go to the concert and a volition to stay home and rest on the couch because they're incompatible. You can't act on them both. But you can certainly have both intentions. You can feel yourself, pulled by the wish to go to the concert and the wish to stay home and vegetate on the couch. I'm not sure that doesn't make some kind of difference, because intentions can and often do conflict. Volitions have a filter on them, namely what's actually possible, in a way that intentions don't, because you can intend to do things that you cannot do. It may not be very rational, but we're not all that rational. And I wonder if that would make much of a difference to you, worrying about the difference between the volition, the intention that actually causes you to act, and the intentions which never quite emerge into volition.
So this may just be a weakness in my reading of Sellars, but I think my assumption was that you couldn't have conflicting intentions, and that's partly an idea that I can't really ascribe you an intention unless I can see you doing the sort of things that you would do if you had that intention or were trying to do that thing. So then for me to say, well, you've got an intention both to go to the concert and to stay at home, if I see you buy a ticket, I'm going to say, no, you've got an intention to go to the concert. And if I see you don't buy a ticket, I'm going to say, you've got an intention to stay at home. It doesn't seem to me it's possible that there's a world in which you both buy a ticket and don't buy a ticket.
But you can see someone vacillating between doing X and doing Y. I mean, that's not, ultimately you may have to choose one or the other and end up doing one or the other, but you can often tell that someone is torn between alternatives, that there are different things that he or she would like to do, has some intention to do it, fulfill some goal that person has. So I don't think that's incompatible with a perfectly empirical psychology. People certainly report being torn between intentions pretty regularly.
So I think I would tend to cash it out as people make a decision and form an intention. So then the sort of vacillating that you're talking about, I don't know if that would be regarded as people changing their mind. I guess but if it's, I think there's a difference between changing your mind.
Well, but part of the
forming.
input to one's rational process that leads to an intention are usually other intentions, right? It's not like you have a bunch of information and poof, there comes a process that suddenly gives you an intention, unless you had some prior intentions that were informing that process. So it's kind of a continuous loop, and it seems to me, well, as I said, it seems to me pretty clear that we do have conflicting intentions quite a bit, and that's an important fact to take into account when you're trying to understand how to interpret human action.
Yeah, I'd be interested in getting some more examples of things that you think of as conflicting intention, where it seems clear that we call them intentions rather than just saying you can't decide what you're doing and you're vacillating.
It's just, so there may be a terminological thing here about intentions. The standard view in the literature, going way back, is that intentions are commitments, and they have consistent, rational consistency requirements on them. If you have intentions that are directed for things that, in light of your beliefs, are inconsistent, it makes you just flat out irrational, in contrast to your preferences and desires and so on. And Sellars himself, he distinguishes between volitions and intentions. Intentions you can have prior to acting. Volitions come into the scene where you actually initiate action. Right. And in my terminology, that's the distinction between intentions and intentions in action. But both of those have the same consistency requirements. So it seems to me when you're talking about having conflicting intentions, it really means something like having conflicting desires, where you haven't yet decided what the preference ordering is. So I think, this seems to me more terminological than anything else, and I'm on Natalie's side with respect to the terminological conventions in philosophy of action here. So that just seems to me there may not be a substantive difference here.
Yeah, okay, maybe just on a comment on that discussion. Sellars has this distinction between desires and intentions as well, right? So there might be a way of getting this possibility of incompatibility in on the level of desires. But then I wanted to follow up on Bernard's question and on Preston's question, because you said at one point it seemed that the reasoning about which identity to have is not instrumentally rational reasoning. And I think Sellars in the end might have had a similar view, like this course guardian view you presented. But I wanted to ask whether we can't at least sometimes construe this reasoning about who I want to be as something where instrumental rationality is important, because I might say, okay, I will feel better when I'm this or that person. For example, if I don't take up the moral point of view on a certain decision problem, I won't be able to look at myself in the mirror anymore. I would just feel bad. Couldn't we think about this choice of identity also in these terms, at least sometimes, not always, maybe at least sometimes?
Ooh, that's very interesting. It's not really something I've thought about before, and several ways of dealing with it sort of come, at least as initial thoughts. So one would be to think whether there's some sort of hierarchy of things that we're doing, so that you could be deliberating about lower ordering ones, but then take some of the higher order goals as things that you're trying to get to. I just don't know. I don't know how that would work if you try to cash it out. I guess another thought is that I suppose the framework is quite course guardian. I don't know if she would take something like because I would feel bad as being the sort of reasoning that counted. I mean, maybe it's an indicator you'd feel bad because it's a bad choice to make, and then you should go and work out why it's a bad choice to make and not do it because it's a bad choice. So I think it would be flipping it into a slightly different framework anyway, that sort of reasoning.
Hi, thank you so much for this. My question's on the same sort of area here, but I wanted to first suggest a passage from On Knowing the Better and Doing the Worse, where I think that connects really directly to the practical identities issue, and it's the very last paragraph. It's paragraph 59 in that text. And so we're imagining a situation where I have sort of a we intention, a moral intention, and I have some I intention commitment to, out of self-love for my own happiness, where there's a conflict between those two. And you'd been describing that predicament as one where the agent would need to choose an identity. And I wonder if that's the right way to think about it. And the language Sellars uses here is that it's a revelation, right? So the self in action at that moment reveals what they really are. And so I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about why we should think about that as choice and how that's different from revelation.
That's interesting. I mean, I almost think you've answered Bernard's point. We don't need to choose her because we have revelations. Why would we want to choose her? That makes it sound like we're not in charge of our own lives if all we ever have is revelations and we don't actually take actions that push us in one way or another. So, I think the revelation idea resonates. Certainly, I'm not against it, but I think I wouldn't want to be a person who only ever worked out who I was by seeing what I did, rather than built myself into a particular type of person by doing particular types of things. I mean, I suspect that probably there's a bit of each in it, that sometimes we don't decide, and then it reveals to us what type of person we are. But on the big issues, hopefully, we would also have a space for deciding.
Okay. All right, I have a question along the same lines, and it's just of how you choose which reasoning you're going to do is very important. But I guess my question is this: do you think we could make progress perhaps by scaling down or lowering the temperature of the examples that we're thinking about? So, for example, I recently had to decide whether I was going to join a small team of other academics to work on this grant. And if I choose to join the grant team, that's going to occupy some of my time, and I will be committed to some we intentions, some, collective actions that and if I don't, then I get to go to the beach or something. But the choice between whether to join the grant, it seems very overpowered to call it a choice of practical identity or something like that. And I think I can make this decision by reasoning about what kinds of things, the sort of shape I want my life to take over the next year or so. Does that help or spark any thoughts?
It seems almost to connect back to Steffi's point about whether you would want, because some of like you're saying, you're thinking about how you want to shape your life to go over the next few years, whether there's other things that you would want to take into account. That's not just what type of person do I want to be, although some of those things are slightly cashed out as what type of life do I want over the next few years. And then I'm also thinking, going back to Steffi, in terms of what have I already decided about how my life should be, and how does it fit?
Okay. All right. That's enough for me.
I'm a bit worried the sort of team reasoning literature gives you a sort of two-level picture where, as you said in Sellars, we've got this three-level picture where, we've got the I intentions, we've got the we intentions of various kinds of groups, and then we've got the sort of categorical stuff. And so, in a lot of the sort of team reasoning literature and also the John Romer stuff, you have this idea that when you move to the we, that's automatically moral. And it seems to me, that's clearly not the case. Here I am living my quiet life. I'm a retired hitman, and the mafia godfather calls me in and says, we need you to do a job, for free. You've got to think from the point of view of the family. You can't just selfishly go away saying, I don't want to be part of this anymore. And now, you have the hitman says, but look, I'm a good union member. I've got to think about not just what's good for the mafia. I've got to think what's good for the community of hitmen, right? So, here, you have sort of a lot of different we's, none of which seem particularly more moral than the I. But I'm wondering whether once you put sort of those sort of intermediate we's in, there might be sort of a further thought that you can have, which is, okay, when we're thinking about team reasoning, we could be thinking about a team consisting of lots of I's. We could also be thinking about, well, what's the team consisting of all the various teams? We've got to think collectively about how to meet the interests of the mafia and the union, right? So a sort of further worry that you might have is why, when you're thinking about the sort of categorical intentions, are we just thinking about the community of all the individuals and not the community of all the possible teams, the team of all the teams, which might be very different from
what the team of all the individuals wants.
That's interesting, and I guess the answer is because the framework is counted and has individuals in a community of ends. But yes, if the ecology has...
I mean, my worry is that's just individualist prejudice that Kant in particular shouldn't have, because he wants to be very formalist about it, isn't it?
Yeah, maybe.
Thank you. Just ask a very similar question to the one I had in mind, but I guess I could formulate it slightly different. It seems to me that it's quite important to think of the kind of we that is addition categorically valid intentions for Sellars. And it seems that that is a question of whether the question is a moral question, and if the person that is answering the moral question is a moral person, then the we intention is not optional, it's mandatory. So it seems that at least when we're thinking about the moral point of view, if one were able to adopt the moral point of view, then it will follow immediately what I need to do. It's no open issue. Now, there are, and I think this follows up from what Bill was saying, there are many different cases of conflict, right? And not all of these conflicts are going to be related to, they're not going to be all moral questions. You know, I can't decide whether I want to be a dancer or a soccer player. And that could be the kind of case where I need to choose between practical identities. But the practical identity of being a rational being that acts in the light of what is right, that seems to, at least in the eyes of Sellars, give you a categorically valid intention. Right? But it might be that I'm not in the position, I haven't trained myself enough to be up to the standards. So I'm not able to make the right decision now, even if I know that that's the right decision. Just to say that I think when we talk about conflict, there is a variety of things here. And it seems that if the we at issue is the we of the moral point of view, then that gives a straightforward answer. Even if I'm, for other reasons, weakness of the will, I can't act from that point of view.
I'm not sure I have an answer to that.
It seems that it will involve make it more complex, that picture, that there would be conflicts between we and I, which are not the conflicts from the moral point of view, stricto sensu, because stricto sensu there is an answer to the question what I should do. I should act for the well-being. I should act from the we perspective, right? From the universal we perspective. That, at least in Sellars, is clear that that is what he would like to say. The issue of the other conflicts, there could be various kinds of situations. There could be that I cannot act, and I know how to act, but then the conflict of practical, for Sellars, that's an imperfect, in a way, it's an imperfect will. It's just that I'm deciding between multiple projects of my life that I can have. I see that could be, it wouldn't be too bad that it might be a conflict of beliefs in some cases, even. It doesn't seem to pose a terrible problem for the view. It interpreted it along these lines, it seems to me.
Yeah, but you did say, oh, it should be obvious what I should do, apart from the will. So again, it seems that somewhere there's a sort of gap creeping in about, like, am I the person that does this moral thing that I know I ought to do? Or maybe I just can't bring myself to do it. So then it's back to, well, whether does it really flow straight through from I see this is the right thing to do, I form an intention and I do it.
Right, but that's not a decision. It's more like whether I am the kind of person. It's whether you are the moral subject or not. Anyway.
That sounds more like the revelation then. If you see yourself doing it, you know you're a moral person, and if you don't, then you're not.
I was wondering if you could go back to the schema of team reasoning that you laid out at the beginning and say a little bit more about how it operates in the context of competition. So I'm thinking about two parties are competing against each other in a game. so they are not on the same team, but there is a different sense in which they are on the same team to the extent that they're playing the same game. So if I'm thinking of like a doubles tennis match, so there's one sense in which me and my partner are a team and the way we form the we intention. But there remains a sense in which us and our competitors are also part of the team, because unless we were in the game together, the game wouldn't happen, right? I'm thinking of kind of like if I'm watching my kids play, sometimes they start off, but they can't agree on the rules, so the game just doesn't happen. So even for competition to happen on either side, there is a different kind of a... So I'm just wondering, is it just a more complicated layering of the team reasoning, or if you can say a little bit more about that?
So, yeah, the very standard thing has been to think about individuals in small groups rather than groups or ecologies with lots of groups or hierarchies of groups. But I don't think there's any reason why this sort of setup shouldn't be able to expand out to take into account various groups. Because you could say, well, okay, so you're playing doubles tennis, so you've got two-person teams and each of them are trying to win the match, and that explains some of their actions using the schema, but then there's another sort of higher level intention to have a tennis match, and all four of them are in it, and that means that they know, for instance, that you shouldn't break the rules, so that, you know, they're going to constrain their actions to be within the rules. So I think in principle there's no reason not to have groups which have groups as members as well.
Thank you so much.